One of the most haunting child disappearance cases in American history has finally been solved. A 3-year-old girl vanished without a trace, along with her own mother. No witnesses. No evidence. No answers. For 42 years, her father searched for her. But what investigators just uncovered changes everything we thought we knew about that day in 1983. That photograph has haunted investigators, family members, and strangers on the internet for longer than most people reading about it have been alive. A 3-year-old girl frozen in a single image, crisp white sailor dress, dark pigtails tied with the kind of careful precision only a mother's hands manage on a Sunday morning, and that smile. That gap-toothed, utterly fearless smile that makes your chest tighten when you realize what came next. Her name was Michelle Marie Newton. Her father called her little Shelley. And on the 2nd of April, 1983, she was there, and then she wasn't. Gone from Louisville, Kentucky, alongside her own mother, swallowed by a silence so complete and so enduring that an entire generation would be born and grow into adulthood before the truth finally clawed its way back into the light. 42 years. Let that number settle for a moment before we go any further. 42 years of a father waking up every single morning and choosing, again, to keep looking. 42 years of a little girl's face on flyers and databases and missing persons registries, aging in digital reconstructions while the real woman lived somewhere unknown, under a name that was not hers. 42 years of a wound that never scabbed over because it was never allowed to. Because Joe Newton, calloused hands, quiet voice, unbreakable will, refused to let the world forget that his daughter existed. And the world, slowly, eventually, finally listened. This is not a story about a stranger in a parking lot. This is not a story about random violence or the terrifying unpredictability of a world full of people who wish children harm. This is a story about something quieter and in many ways more devastating than all of that. This is a story about a parental abduction, a crime that sits in a legal and emotional category all its own, one that leaves its victims in a particular kind of limbo that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never experienced it. The child is missing but not necessarily dead. The abductor is known but not findable. The grief is real but has no funeral, no closure, no moment where the community gathers and says together that this chapter has ended. It simply continues. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, until something breaks. In this case, what broke it was a combination of things that could only have come together in the specific moment they did: modern forensic science that did not exist when Shelley vanished, a single tipster who looked at something and felt that particular prickle at the back of the neck that says something is wrong here, and a father who had been tending the flame for so long that when the world finally arrived with answers, he was still there, still waiting, still ready. Welcome to Cold Case, Solved Files. If you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to make sure that the people this world has tried to forget are never actually forgotten. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because every single case we cover is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's reason for getting out of bed in the morning. You will not want to miss a single one. Now let us go back. Let us go all the way back to the spring of 1983, to a blue-collar neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky, where a family was preparing for a transition that none of them could have known would end the way it did. Louisville in the early 1980s was a city caught between two versions of itself. The old industrial identity, the one built on manufacturing jobs and union wages and the kind of work that left permanent marks on the body, was beginning to give way to something newer, something less certain, something that required a different kind of adaptability from the people who had built their lives around the assumption that the old way would last. The neighborhoods where working families had planted themselves for generations were feeling that pressure in 100 small ways. Hours being cut at plants. Overtime disappearing. The quiet anxiety that settles into a household when the future stops feeling predictable. Joe Newton understood that world intimately. He was 33 years old in the spring of 1983, and he carried his age the way men of his generation and background tended to, in the lines of his hands, in the set of his jaw, in the particular economy of movement that comes from spending years doing physical labor without complaint. He was not a man given to big declarations or dramatic gestures. He was the kind of man who showed up. Who fixed things when they broke. Who stayed when staying was hard. The neighbors who knew him would later struggle to find the words to describe him because he was, in the most essential sense, exactly what he appeared to be, a husband, a father, a working man who wanted nothing more complicated than to take care of his family and watch his daughter grow up. Deborah Lee Newton was his wife, and their life together had been built on the same foundations that held up most marriages in their community: shared work, shared struggle, the daily negotiation of two people trying to make a life that added up to more than the sum of its difficulties. They had their problems. Every marriage does, and this one was no exception. But the problems, as far as anyone on the outside could see, were the ordinary kind. The kind that get worked through. The kind that don't end with a child disappearing. And then there was Shelley. Michelle Marie Newton arrived on the 5th of October, 1979, and from the moment she entered the world she had a quality that the people around her consistently struggled to articulate but never struggled to feel. There are children who light up a room as a figure of speech, and then there are children who actually do it, who carry some quality of attention and warmth and electric curiosity that makes adults stop what they are doing and lean in. Shelley was the second kind. Everyone who encountered her in those early years remembered her that way. The neighbors, the family friends, the people at church, they all had a version of the same story. A little girl who met you with her whole self. Who asked questions with genuine hunger for the answers. Who gave hugs the way only very young children give them, with total commitment, as if the hug itself were the most important thing happening in the world at that exact moment. She adored her stuffed animals with the fierce and particular devotion that toddlers reserve for the things they have decided are theirs. She had favorites. She had routines. She had the elaborate internal logic of a 3-year-old that made complete and total sense to her and required careful explanation for any adult trying to follow along. And she had her evenings with her father, those ritual walks through the neighborhood at the end of the day when Joe would lift her onto his shoulders and carry her through the long light of a Kentucky evening, past the oak trees that lined the sidewalks, past the houses of people who would wave from their porches, past the small geography of a child's world that was, in those moments, exactly large enough. That was Shelley's life in the spring of 1983. Small and bright and full of the particular safety that children feel when they are held inside a world that has not yet shown them its edges. The Newton family was preparing for a change that spring. The details of what that change entailed, and what pressures it placed on Joe and Deborah's marriage, would become critically important to understanding everything that followed. Because the dissolution of a marriage is never a single event. It is a long process, a series of smaller ruptures and failed repairs, a slow accumulation of moments where the distance between two people grows until it can no longer be crossed by ordinary means. And when that process reaches its final stages, when the attorneys are involved and the question of custody is on the table, something changes in the emotional atmosphere of the household in ways that are almost impossible to protect a child from entirely. Joe and Deborah were heading toward the end of their marriage that spring. The specific reasons belonged to them alone, as the specific reasons for any marriage's collapse always do, but the consequences of that collapse were about to extend far beyond the two of them. Because the moment a child becomes the subject of a custody dispute, she also becomes, in the most terrible sense, a bargaining chip. Not always intentionally. Not always consciously. But the logic of contested custody has a way of distorting the thinking of even people who began the process with the best intentions, pulling them toward choices they never would have imagined making when they were young and still in love and still building something together. What happened on the 2nd of April, 1983 began long before that date. It began in the slow collapse of a marriage, in the quiet escalation of a custody conflict, in the particular desperation of a parent who has decided that losing access to her child is a loss she is not willing to accept through legal channels. It began in the mind of Deborah Lee Newton, in whatever calculus she ran in the weeks and months before that spring morning, arriving at the conclusion that the only way she could keep her daughter was to disappear with her entirely. On the 2nd of April, 1983, Deborah Newton took Michelle and left Louisville, Kentucky. She did not tell Joe where she was going. She did not leave a note that would have allowed him to find them. She did not go through the legal system, did not argue her case before a judge, did not attempt to resolve the custody question by any of the means that exist for exactly that purpose. She simply took her daughter and vanished, and in doing so she committed a crime that would not be fully reckoned with for 42 years. Joe Newton came home to an empty house. Think about that moment. The specific quality of an empty house that used to be full. The way silence has a texture in a place where there was recently noise, the noise of a 3-year-old who never stopped moving, never stopped asking, never stopped needing. The way you walk through rooms looking for an explanation that isn't there. The way the stuffed animals on the floor look different when the child who owned them is gone. Joe Newton stood in that emptiness and understood, with the particular clarity of a parent's instinct, that this was not ordinary. This was not Deborah taking Shelley to her mother's for the afternoon. This was not a misunderstanding that a phone call would resolve. Something had happened. Something had been done. And whatever it was, it had been done deliberately. He called the police. He reported his daughter missing. He began the process that he would sustain, without interruption, for the next 4 decades, the process of searching, of refusing to accept that the silence meant the end of the story, of insisting to whoever would listen that his daughter was out there somewhere and that the fact of her continued existence meant she could still be found. Parental abduction is a crime that the legal system has historically treated with an ambivalence that is deeply damaging to the parents left behind. It occupies an uncomfortable middle space between the terror of a stranger abduction, which commands immediate, massive law enforcement response, and the messy, emotionally complicated territory of family law, where the question of who gets the child is already contested and where the assumption can be made, however incorrectly, that a mother who takes her own child is not really a danger to that child. This assumption is wrong in ways that are both obvious and subtle. It is wrong because it ignores the harm done to the left-behind parent. It is wrong because it ignores the harm done to the child, who is severed from half of her family, from her home, from her community, from her identity. And it is wrong because it creates a legal vacuum in which cases like Shelley's can sit for 42 years, tended only by the grief of a father and the intermittent attention of a system with larger crises always pressing in from every direction. Joe filed the appropriate reports. He contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He made sure Shelley's photograph and information were in every database he could find. He spoke to reporters when reporters would listen. He kept her face in circulation through every channel available to him, adapting as the channels changed over the decades, from flyers to fax networks to early internet forums to social media, following the technology wherever it went, because wherever the technology went was where the attention of the public could potentially be directed. And the years passed. Michelle Marie Newton would have turned 4 in October of 1983. She would have started kindergarten in 1985. She would have been in middle school when the Berlin Wall came down, in high school when the World Wide Web became a thing ordinary people could access, in her mid-20s on the morning of September the 11th, 2001. She would have turned 30 in 2009, 40 in 2019. Joe Newton tracked all of these birthdays in whatever way a father tracks the birthdays of a child he cannot hold or call or sit across from at a dinner table. He tracked them by continuing to exist, by continuing to search, by refusing to allow the accumulation of years to convince him that 43 was too old to keep looking, or 53, or 63. The age-progressed photographs that missing persons organizations create are one of the most quietly devastating technologies in the entire apparatus of searching for the disappeared. They take the last known image of a person, frozen in whatever moment the camera caught them, and project forward, using the science of how faces change with time, to produce a portrait of who that person might be today. Joe had these done for Shelley. As she would have looked at 10. At 18. At 25. The images circulated. They were shared. They appeared on websites dedicated to missing persons cases, in the feeds of people who had built communities around the work of keeping these cases alive. And still, nothing. Deborah Newton had done what successful parental abductors do. She had created enough distance between her old life and her new one that the threads connecting them were too thin to follow. She had changed her name, or Shelley's name, or both. She had built a new identity in a new place, and she had maintained that identity through the years with the discipline of someone who understood that any slip, any moment of inattention, could unravel everything. The fact that she managed to sustain this for 42 years is a testament both to her determination and to the limitations of the systems that should have found her far sooner. Because those systems had their failures. The technology of the early 1980s was simply not equipped to track a determined person who did not want to be found. There were no national fingerprint databases accessible to ordinary law enforcement in Louisville. There was no DNA registry. There was no internet to search. The tools available to Joe Newton and to the investigators who worked his daughter's case were the tools of their era: photographs, phone calls, paper files, the hope that someone somewhere would recognize a face on a flyer and make a call. As the decades passed and the technology evolved, new possibilities opened. Databases were digitized. Law enforcement agencies developed better protocols for sharing information across jurisdictions. The science of forensic genealogy, using DNA to identify not just individuals but their relatives, and through those relatives, the individuals themselves, emerged from the world of academic genetics and became one of the most powerful tools for solving cold cases that law enforcement had ever possessed. Cases that had sat in silence for 20, 30, 40 years began to move again as investigators applied these new tools to old evidence. Shelley's case was among them. Exactly how, and exactly when, and exactly what sequence of events led from decades of silence to resolution, that is the story we are about to tell in full. But first it is worth sitting for a moment with what the intervening years actually meant. Not as a timeline. Not as a sequence of investigative steps. But as a human experience. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "I am still here," because this story is far from over, and the people who follow it to the end are the people who make sure cases like Shelley's never get buried again. Joe Newton was 33 years old when his daughter disappeared. He was a young man. He had his whole life ahead of him, the kind of life that, in a different version of this story, would have included watching Shelley graduate from high school, walking her down an aisle if she wanted that, becoming a grandfather to her children. All of that was taken from him on the 2nd of April, 1983. Not by death, or at least, not certainly by death. By absence. By the particular cruelty of a disappearance that leaves no body, no confirmed fate, no permission to grieve and move through grief towards something like peace. He did not stop living. He could not have stopped living, because stopping was not in him. But he lived differently from the moment Shelley vanished, with a portion of his attention always elsewhere, always turned toward the question of where she was, always listening for the phone call or the knock at the door or the news alert that would tell him the search was over. This is what parental abduction does to the parents it leaves behind. It does not take their life. It takes the unguarded version of it. The version that existed before the constant vigilance, the version that could sit at a dinner table without wondering, could laugh without the laughter being shadowed, could sleep without the mind running its searches even in the dark. Across the country, in whatever new life Deborah Newton had constructed, Shelley was growing up. She was going through the stages of childhood and adolescence and young adulthood that her father was tracking only through the age progression software and his own imagination. She was going to school somewhere, making friends somewhere, becoming the particular person that a combination of her genetics and her environment and her experiences was shaping her into. She was living, in other words. She was alive. And that fact, the fact of her continued life, the life her father was not permitted to be part of, is both the most hopeful thing about this story and, in some ways, the most painful. Because there is another person at the center of this story who rarely gets examined with the same depth as the father or the mother, and that person is Shelley herself. Whatever name she was living under. Whatever story she had been told about who she was and where she came from. Whatever memories she had of Louisville, or of her father, or of the life that ended for her on the 2nd of April, 1983, memories that, at 3 years old, would have been fragmentary at best, impressionistic, the kind that live in the body rather than the mind. She grew up as someone. She had a life. And at some point, in whatever way the truth arrives for people who have been living inside someone else's constructed story, she would have to reckon with who that someone was and what had been done to her. That reckoning, when it came, would not be simple. It never is in cases like this. The parent who abducts a child does not always do so without love. That is one of the most confusing aspects of parental abduction. The crime is committed out of a distorted version of love, a love that has become possessive and desperate and finally criminal, but that still understands itself as love. Shelley, growing up with Deborah, was not growing up with a monster. She was growing up with her mother. She was being cared for, in whatever way Deborah was capable of caring for her. And when the truth of her identity finally surfaced, she would be asked to hold simultaneously the mother she knew and loved and the crime that mother had committed against her, against the 3-year-old version of her who had no say in any of it, and against the father who had spent 42 years looking. That is a weight that no one should have to carry. But it is the weight that parental abduction leaves for the child at the center of it, long after everything else has been resolved. Now let us talk about what resolution looked like in this case. Let us talk about what it took, specifically, mechanically, in terms of the actual events and the actual tools, to reach across 42 years and pull the truth back into the present. The first element was DNA. Forensic genealogy had become, by the late 2010s and into the 2020s, one of the most powerful and controversial tools in the law enforcement arsenal. The basic principle is elegant. Everyone who has taken a consumer DNA test and uploaded their results to a genealogy database is, without necessarily realizing it, providing investigators with a potential thread. Because DNA is inherited. Because everyone who shares your DNA shares a portion of your family tree. And because a sufficiently skilled genealogist, working with a reference sample and a large enough database, can map the family connections radiating outward from that sample and narrow in on a specific individual even if that individual has never taken a DNA test themselves. This was the technology that had broken open the Golden State Killer case in 2018, shocking the true crime world and law enforcement alike with the demonstration of just how much information was buried in the genealogy databases that millions of Americans had been contributing to voluntarily for years. And it was the technology that investigators working Shelley's case would eventually turn toward as every other avenue had run its course. The specifics of how Shelley's DNA was obtained for comparison, and when that comparison was made, and what the results showed, these details unfolded as the investigation progressed through the years following the Golden State Killer breakthrough, as law enforcement agencies around the country began systematically applying forensic genealogy to their own long unsolved cases. Joe Newton's case was exactly the kind that this technology was designed for. Decades old. No new physical evidence to follow. A known perpetrator who had simply vanished into a new life. And a father who had been waiting long enough. But DNA alone would not have been sufficient. DNA tells you who someone is related to. It does not tell you where they are living in the present day under whatever name they have adopted. The bridge between the genetic evidence and the physical location of a living person required the second element of this resolution, the tipster. Tipsters in cold cases occupy a peculiar and important role in the ecosystem of investigation. They are not law enforcement. They are not forensic scientists. They are ordinary people who happen to encounter something that does not fit, a face that matches a photograph they have seen somewhere, a name that triggers a memory, a story that contains an inconsistency that nags at them until they do something about it. The vast majority of tips that come into cold case investigators are not useful. They are generated by the pattern-matching tendency of the human brain, which is remarkably good at finding connections but not always good at distinguishing between real connections and coincidental ones. Investigators have to filter through enormous volumes of irrelevant information to find the tip that matters. In Shelley's case, someone looked at something, a face, a detail, a combination of elements that didn't add up, and they felt that prickle. They felt the wrongness of it. And instead of letting the feeling pass, instead of telling themselves it was probably nothing, they made a call or sent a message or in some other way communicated what they had noticed to someone who could act on it. That act of civic courage, because it takes a particular kind of courage to trust your instincts and make the report, to risk being wrong, to risk the awkwardness and the judgment that comes with pointing a finger at someone in a community, that act was the human link in the chain that everything else depended on. We do not always know the names of the tipsters in resolved cold cases. Often they request anonymity, and that request is honored, and appropriately so. What we know is that they existed. That one person's willingness to pay attention and act on what they noticed made the difference between a case that remained unsolved and a case that finally, after 42 years, delivered its truth. The third element was Joe himself. Not as an investigator, he was not trained for that, and the professional investigators in this case deserve the full credit for the technical work they performed. But as the reason the case remained alive. As the reason Shelley's face continued to circulate in databases and on websites and in the awareness of the people who follow missing persons cases. As the reason that when a tipster noticed something and asked themselves whether it was worth making a report about, there was information available to them, photographs, details, context, that allowed them to connect what they were seeing to a specific missing child whose father had spent 4 decades refusing to let her be forgotten. Cases go cold not only because the trail runs out but because attention fades. The public moves on. The media moves on. The investigators are reassigned to newer cases with fresher evidence and more urgent timelines. And the missing persons case sits in a drawer, accumulating dust, waiting for someone to open it again. Joe Newton's 42 years of refusing to move on ensured that Shelley's case was never entirely in the drawer. It was always, at some level, in circulation. Always available to be encountered by the right person at the right moment. His persistence was not just an emotional act. It was a strategic one, even if he never framed it that way. Now let us talk about what the resolution actually looked like. Let us talk about what happened in the days and weeks when the pieces came together, when the DNA and the tip and the decades of searching converged into a moment of contact that changed everything. Investigators, once they had enough to act on, had to approach this situation with extraordinary care. Shelley Newton, Michelle Marie Newton, had been living her life under a different identity for 42 years. She was not a 3-year-old who could be collected from a location and returned to her father like a recovered piece of property. She was a woman in her mid-40s. She had her own history, her own relationships, her own sense of who she was. She had, almost certainly, formed deep emotional bonds with her mother regardless of what her mother had done. And she had the right, the absolute, unqualified right, to know the truth about her identity and to decide for herself what she wanted to do with that truth. This is one of the aspects of resolved parental abduction cases that gets insufficient attention in the true crime space, where the emphasis tends to fall on the investigative arc and the reunion narrative rather than on the complicated human reality of what happens after the case is officially closed. Shelley was a victim. That is clear. The crime committed against her was real and its effects were real. But she was also a person who had built a life, and the revelation of what had been done to her was not a gift that could simply be unwrapped and enjoyed. It was a seismic event. It was the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she knew about herself. It was the simultaneous discovery that her name was not her name, that her history was not her history, that there was a father somewhere who had been looking for her for longer than she had been alive under the name she knew. Investigators who work these cases, the ones who do it well, understand that the contact moment has to be handled with the care of a precise instrument. Too abrupt, and the recovered person shuts down, retreats, perhaps never fully engages with the truth of what has been revealed. Too slow, and the opportunity is lost, the cover story is reinforced, the threads are cut. There is a protocol, developed over years of similar cases, for how to approach someone who may not know they are missing. For how to present evidence without overwhelming. For how to create a space in which the truth can be received rather than deflected. What Shelley experienced in those first moments of revelation, what she felt when she understood what she was being told, when she began to process the fact that Michelle Marie Newton and the person she believed herself to be were the same person, that belongs to her. It is not ours to speculate about in detail. What we can say, based on the general pattern of how these moments unfold, is that it was not simple. It was not a clean, cinematic reunion with an orchestral score beneath it. It was complicated and painful and probably disorienting in ways that took a long time to fully understand. And it happened to a real person who had done nothing to deserve any of it. Joe Newton, when he received the news, was in a different position. He had been waiting for this call, or dreading the other kind of call, the one that would tell him his daughter was dead, for 42 years. He had rehearsed it in his mind thousands of times, had imagined every possible version of how it might go, had prepared himself as thoroughly as a person can prepare for something that remains hypothetical until the moment it becomes real. And then the moment became real. And whatever preparation he had done turned out to be entirely insufficient, as it always is, because the real thing is never quite like the rehearsal. She was alive. Shelley was alive. Michelle Marie Newton, whoever she had become, whatever name she was using, whatever life she had built, she was in the world, breathing, existing, reachable. That fact alone, before any reunion, before any conversation, before any decision about what the next step would be, that fact alone was the answer to a question Joe had been living inside for 4 decades. The legal consequences for Deborah Newton followed the discovery. The crime of parental abduction has a complex relationship with statutes of limitations, which vary by state and which have been the subject of significant legal debate over the years precisely because cases like this one demonstrate how arbitrary the time limits can feel when measured against the actual duration of the harm. 42 years of a father's life disrupted. 42 years of a daughter's identity falsified. 42 years of a crime being sustained, actively, every single day. The question of whether and how to prosecute Deborah Newton for what she had done was one that prosecutors would have to weigh carefully against a range of factors: the strength of the evidence, the age of the perpetrator, the wishes of the victim, the capacity of the legal system to deliver something that resembled justice across such a vast span of time. What Deborah had sustained for 42 years was not simply a one-time act of desperation. It was a sustained, deliberate, daily choice. Every morning that she woke up in her new identity, every time she answered to whatever name she had taken, every time she prevented Shelley from knowing who she really was, these were not echoes of the original crime. They were the crime, renewed. They were 42 years of active deception, sustained against a child who had no capacity to resist it and a father who had no power to pierce it through ordinary means. The forensic work that identified Shelley did not come from nowhere. It came from the investment that law enforcement agencies and nonprofit organizations had made over the years in building and maintaining the databases and the expertise necessary to apply forensic genealogy to cold cases. The DOE Network. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The FBI's National Crime Information Center. The state-level agencies that had kept Joe Newton's case alive in their systems even when no active leads were being pursued. These institutions, imperfect as they are, performed their function in this case. They preserved the thread. They kept the information available. They ensured that when the technology finally caught up to the case, there was a case to be caught up to. And the people who work in missing persons recovery, the investigators, the forensic genealogists, the victim advocates, the non-profit volunteers who spend their personal time and their emotional energy on cases that the formal system has moved past, deserve recognition that they rarely receive. They work in a field defined by its failures. For every Shelley Newton who is found, there are dozens of cases in every state that remain unresolved, that sit in the databases waiting for the technology or the tipster or the coincidence that will break them open. The people who sustain that work, who keep showing up despite the ratio of unsolved to solved, are carrying a particular kind of professional grief that is largely invisible to the public. Joe Newton was one of them, in his own way. He was not a professional. He did not have the training or the resources of a law enforcement investigator. But he did the work that was available to him, and he did it without interruption for 42 years, and that work was part of what made the resolution possible. There is something important to say here about the nature of parental abduction as a crime, and specifically about the way it has been gendered in both legal treatment and public perception. Deborah Newton was a mother. The cultural narrative around mothers is powerful and persistent, and it has historically influenced how parental abduction cases are handled when the abductor is the mother rather than the father. There is an assumption, rarely articulated but frequently operative, that a mother who takes her child cannot be doing something truly dangerous, because mothers are nurturing, because mothers love their children, because what a mother does with her own child is somehow less criminal than what a stranger would do. This assumption has caused enormous harm to the fathers, and sometimes mothers, left behind in these cases. It has allowed abductors to construct new lives and maintain them for years with less scrutiny than they deserved. It has made it harder for the left-behind parent to be taken seriously when they insist that what happened to them and their child was a serious crime deserving serious attention. Jo Newton was taken seriously, eventually. But the 42 years it required stands as its own argument for how much work remains to be done in changing the way the system treats parental abduction cases from the moment they are reported. Let us also talk about Louisville. About the city that Shelley left at 3 years old and that she has been connected to, through the record of her disappearance, ever since. Louisville is a city with a complicated history and a community of people who, when cases like this become public, tend to respond with the particular mix of grief and determination and civic pride that characterizes communities that take their missing person seriously. The people who knew Jo Newton over the 4 decades of his search, the neighbors who watched him age, the friends who supported him, the community members who shared Shelley's image across social media as the platforms emerged, they are part of this story too, even if their individual names are not recorded in any official account. Community matters in cold cases in ways that are difficult to quantify. It matters because it sustains the searchers. It matters because it generates the tips. It matters because it keeps the face of a missing child visible in the public consciousness rather than allowing her to become a number in a database that only specialists ever access. Jo Newton's community, however it evolved over 42 years, through however many changes in neighborhood and circumstance and the general upheaval that 4 decades of ordinary life necessarily brings, was part of what kept him going. No one sustains that kind of search in complete isolation. There are people in the background of every story like this one who provided the meals, the phone calls, the company, the reminders that the person searching was not only a searcher but also a father, a friend, a neighbor, a human being who needed more than the search to keep living. Now, what does resolution look like for a family that has been separated not by death but by deliberate erasure? What does it look like to attempt to rebuild a relationship between a father and a daughter when the daughter has spent her entire conscious life without him, shaped by a narrative that may have included things said about him that were not true, formed by the absence of exactly the kind of paternal presence that Jo Newton had been desperate to provide? These questions do not have easy answers. They are the questions that family therapists and trauma specialists who work with recovered abduction victims grapple with on a case-by-case basis, because every situation is different, every person's capacity for processing and integrating this kind of revelation is different, every family's pre-existing dynamics and post-discovery circumstances are different. What is consistent across cases is that reunification, when it happens, is rarely the clean, joyful moment that media coverage tends to present. It is the beginning of a long process of negotiation, of 2 people who are biologically parent and child but who are, in every experiential sense, strangers to each other, finding out whether a relationship is possible and, if so, what shape that relationship might take. Jo Newton deserved a relationship with his daughter. Shelley deserved to know her father. Whether they were able to build one, and what that building looked like in the months and years following the resolution of the case, that is a story that belongs to them in its private details, even as the public version of their story belongs to all of us who care about what happens when the system finally, belatedly, delivers something like justice. The story of Michelle Marie Newton is, at its core, a story about what happens when one parent makes a unilateral decision that affects everyone around her and then sustains the decision for decades while the people harmed by it have no recourse but to keep looking. It is a story about the inadequacy of the systems that should have found Shelley long before 42 years had passed. It is a story about the extraordinary persistence of one man who refused to let his daughter become a statistic. And it is a story about a little girl in a white sailor dress who grew up to be a woman who had to confront the truth of who she was in the most disorienting circumstances imaginable. We tell stories like this one not because they are entertainment, though the human drama in them is undeniable. We tell them because they matter. Because the Shelley Newtons of the world deserve to have their stories told accurately, in full, without flinching from the complicated truth of what was done to them and what it cost the people who loved them. We tell them because the families still searching, the Joes, the parents and siblings and children who are living right now in the particular limbo of having a person they love who is present in the world but unreachable, deserve to know that there is a community of people paying attention, holding space, refusing to look away. The databases are full of cases that have not yet reached their resolution. Children who vanished decades ago and whose age-progressed images are circulating right now in the feeds of people who might recognize a face. Parents who are aging, who are running out of the years they had imagined spending with the child who was taken from them. Investigators who are applying new technologies to old evidence and hoping for the combination of factors that turned the tide in Shelley's case. Every single one of those cases involves a real person. Every single one of them is waiting for the version of this story that ends with the truth coming out. Cold cases are not just history. They are present. They are ongoing. They are happening right now in real time, in the lives of real people who did not choose to be part of a case file and who have no option but to live inside the uncertainty until something changes. What we do, what this channel does, what the community of people who follow these cases does, is refuse to let that uncertainty go unwitnessed. We show up. We pay attention. We share the photographs and the details and the stories. We create the conditions under which a tipster might encounter a face and feel that prickle and make the call. We are not law enforcement. We are not forensic scientists. But we are not nothing. Joe Newton spent 42 years showing what not nothing looks like. There is a conversation that happens in the true crime community sometimes, about whether this kind of storytelling is ethical, whether the public consumption of real people's real pain is something that can be done responsibly, or whether the very act of packaging tragedy into content is itself a violation of the people at the center of it. It is a legitimate conversation, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. At Cold Case, Solved Files, the way we try to navigate that tension is by keeping the humanity of the victim at the center of everything. Not the forensic details. Not the investigative timeline. Not the ghoulish appeal of the crime itself. The person. The little girl in the sailor dress. The father on his shoulders in the evening light. The stuffed animals on the floor of an empty house. Shelley Newton is not a case number. She is not a cautionary tale. She is not a symbol of systemic failure, though her case is that too. She is a person who was wrong before she was old enough to understand what was happening, who grew up carrying an identity that was not hers, who eventually had to face a truth that rearranged everything she knew about herself. She deserved better at every stage of this story. She deserved a father who was present throughout her childhood. She deserved a system that found her in years rather than decades. She deserved the truth delivered in a way that gave her the maximum possible support in processing it. Whether she received all of that is a question that her private life will answer, not the public record. What the public record does show, what it shows definitively and without ambiguity, is that her father was there. He was there through every stage of what the years brought. He was there, tending the flame, refusing the closure that would have required him to give up on her. And when the flame finally caught, when the technology and the tipster and the 42 years of searching all converged into a moment of truth, Joe Newton was there for that too. That is worth something. That is worth more than something. In a story full of things that went wrong and systems that failed and a crime that was sustained for longer than it should have been possible to sustain it, Joe Newton's 42 years of showing up is the part that works. It is the part that redeems, not the crime, not the failure, but the story. It is the part that says that love, stubbornly applied, can outlast even the most thorough attempts to extinguish it. The photograph still exists. The little girl in the white sailor dress with the pigtails and the gap-toothed smile. It has been scanned and uploaded and shared and printed and posted and shared again across 42 years and a dozen different technologies. It has been encountered by millions of people, most of whom kept scrolling, some of whom paused and felt something, a handful of whom did something with what they felt. It has done its work, that photograph. It kept her face in the world. It kept her real. Michelle Marie Newton. Little Shelley. She was real in 1983 when her father carried her through the evening light under the oak trees, and she was real through every year of her absence, and she is real now, in whatever life she is living, under whatever name, with whatever understanding of her own history she has been able to construct from the pieces she was handed. She was always real. Joan Newton knew it. And the system, finally, after 42 years, caught up to what he knew. This is Cold Case, Solved Files, and if this story stayed with you, if Shelley's name is going to linger in your mind after you close this video, if Joan Newton's 42 years of refusing to give up reminded you of something true about what love looks like when it is tested past every reasonable limit, then do something with that feeling. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling us which case you want us to cover next, because there are thousands of Shelleys still waiting, and every pair of eyes we add to this community is one more chance that the right person sees the right face at the right moment and makes the call that changes everything. The voiceless deserve a voice. And as long as you are here, we will never stop giving them one.